Next time you're ready to buy something on Amazon, use our special link by going to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. With books, movies, clothes, toys, electronics, and all of the other wonderful products that Amazon has to offer, you can make your regular purchases and help support the show. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your Amazon purchases and help support the Wake Up Call podcast at no extra cost to you. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Humberto Fontova about Fidel Castro. Humberto was born in Cuba before he and his family fled to the United States in 1961. He is the author of Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant, and The Longest Romance, The Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro. He is also the author of Exposing the Real Che Guevara and The Useful Idiots Who Idolize Him. You can follow his work at hfontova.com. You can find him on Facebook under Humberto Fontova, with Humberto spelled with an H, and on Twitter at hfontova. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Castro. Humberto, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here, amigo. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me. So there are obviously a lot of topics to get to and all sorts of directions we could take this conversation, but I just want to start with a brief summary of Fidel Castro and who he was and the key points of his legacy.
Well, here's what people aren't getting from the media, have never gotten from the media. We're talking about a regime, the Fidel Castro regime, that jailed political prisoners at a higher rate than did Stalin's regime during the height of the Great Terror. Notice I said rate, obviously not in absolute numbers, because Cuba is a country of 6.8 million people. They murdered, in absolute numbers, more political prisoners in their first 3 years in power than Hitler's regime murdered in his first 6 years in power. And they drove 20 times as many people to die trying to escape Cuba as died trying to escape East Germany. That's basically what you've got to keep in the back of your mind through this entire conversation. Would it occur to anyone to sing the praises of East German free health care and education? No, because even liberals, if you hold their feet to the fire, will admit that East Germany was obviously a horrible place. My goodness, they had to build a wall to keep people in, and 200 to 300 people died trying to escape it. Oh my God, isn't it obviously make East Germany a horrible place? Folks, from 20 to 47,000 people have died trying to escape Castro's Cuba, and counting, by the way. And what makes this even more horrible than the East German figures is that prior to Castroism, Cuba, a prosperous first world country, took in more immigrants as a percentage of population than did the United States, including the Ellis Island years. Again, the media doesn't go out of its way to make these facts known.
Yeah, let's talk about Cuba before Castro a little bit more. What was the standard of living like in Cuba before Castro came to power, and who was Batista, and what was he like?
He was a corrupt fellow. He wasn't a dictator by the standards of Castro, anywhere near it, anywhere. But the point is, all during the 50s, all during the 40s, Cuba had net immigration. Cuba had a higher per capita income in the 1950s than half of Europe. It had double Spain's per capita income. Mostly Europe, Southern Europe. It had double Japan's per capita income. Cubans owned as many cars per capita in 1958 as those famous car fanatics, the Italians. As a matter of fact, at the time of Castro's takeover in January of 1959, the Italian embassy in Rome had a backlog of 14,000. No, the Cuban embassy in Rome had a backlog of 14,000 Italians clamoring for visas to immigrate to Cuba. This is Italy, folks. This is not Haiti. This is not the Dominican Republic. This is Italy. Italians would clamor to move to Cuba. More Americans lived in Cuba during the 1950s than Cubans lived in the United States. And this was at a time when Cubans could get U.S. visas for the asking. The Cuban peso was on par. In fact, for a few years, it was valued slightly higher than the American dollar. More Americans lived in Cuba than Cubans lived in the U.S., and Cubans had come, my parents would come to the U.S. on vacations, but they would gladly go back home. The U.S. was a nice place to visit, but they wouldn't want to live here unless forced to, and of course that forcing eventually came about.
Yeah, and I want to get into your family's story in a little bit, but I want to continue to establish this background of who Castro was and what his regime was like and continues to be like even after his death. So let's look at how Castro came to power, because the way you just portrayed Cuba was
who on earth, why did they have a revolution if things were so hunky-dory, Humberto?
Exactly. How'd that happen?
Yeah, well, it's because it wasn't billed as a revolution. It was billed as essentially a rebellion, if you want to be technical, as a political change. A change that were going to oust the corrupt and sporadically brutal Batista regime and replace it with Switzerland, Costa Rica type Christian democracy. That's why it wasn't billed as a socio-economic upheaval. It was billed as, and by the way, the U.S., especially the State Department and the CIA, fell for Castro's movement lies. And they were billing the U.S. In fact, there was a quote from the U.S. ambassador to Cuba. His name was Earl Smith. He wrote a famous book, and it's fully, thoroughly, absolutely documented in my books. He said, without U.S. help, Castro would have never gotten into power. Everyone in the U.S. State Department and everyone in the CIA was pro-Castro. And Cubans knew this. Middle class and upper class Cubans knew this. Well, the U.S. is backing Castro. Good grief, they must know what they're doing. Famous last words,
Yeah, can you get into the connections between Castro and the CIA a little bit more, and the support the CIA had for him? Because the conventional narrative seems to be that the U.S. government and the CIA were behind Batista, but they were opposed to Castro, and they wanted Castro gone, and they wanted to take him out and assassinate Castro. So can you explain a little more of why that is nonsense?
Well, I'll just give you quotes from the CIA. A guy named Robert Reynolds was the chief of the CIA for the Caribbean in 1960, and he went and visited Cuba in 1972, and he was there gushing with his old friends. He says, me and my entire staff were Fidelistas. Fidelistas. That's what he said. Jim Noel, he was the CIA station chief in Havana, 1958, and he wrote, and these quotes are all documented in my books, by the way. He says, don't worry, we've infiltrated Castro and Che Guevara's group in the Sierra Mountains. They have no connections with any communists whatsoever. And again, as a matter of fact, the CIA went so far as to financially back the Castro regime, handing checks to them, one for $50,000 in Santiago, Cuba. And it's funny because my latest book, The Longest Romance, devoted several chapters to this, and the very guy, his name is Robert Chapman, who was the CIA station chief in Santiago, Cuba, went ballistic. In the International Journal of Intelligence, he wrote about it, bashing my book, but he did not refute a single one of my facts. He was just embarrassed that I brought to light how the CIA helped Castro into power. Again, the U.S. ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith, everyone in the CIA was pro-Castro. I don't know, I don't know how much more elaborate I can get.
Well, it's just incredible. So what were the connections between Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union and the KGB, and with communism in general prior to his coming to power?
Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother, had a KGB case officer since 1954 when he had visited behind the Iron Curtain. Che Guevara, when the Cuban rebels, Che, Raul Castro, had trained in Mexico for the so-called invasion of Cuba in 1956, where they started the guerrilla war, and they were arrested in Mexico. Che Guevara was arrested in Mexico in 1955, and he had in his pocket the card of the KGB's Latin American chief. Naturally, it didn't say Nikolai Leonev, which is his name, by the way, chief of the It had him under another name, but already in 1955, Che Guevara and Raul Castro had KGB case officers. So this nonsense that the U.S. bullied poor little Castro, innocent little Castro, into the arms of Mother Russia is complete poppycock, and it's spread by Castro's propaganda ministry.
Okay, so let's get into the Castro regime. So with Castro in power, we saw the onset of a Stalinist type of government in Cuba, and we saw murders and tortures of political prisoners, as you mentioned earlier. So can you talk about that a little bit more, and who did they go after?
Basically, I devoted in the chapter in my book, I called it the Cuban Katyn Massacre. Many of our listeners may recall that in Poland, the Soviet Union under Stalin in 1940, they have what's called the Katyn Massacre. That's when Stalin was teamed up with Hitler, where Stalin's KGB and GRU people basically liquidated, decapitated the Polish armed forces, or the ones that came under their control, in their half of Poland. It's called the Katyn Massacre. They slaughtered 50,000 officers. They basically liquidated the officer corps of the Polish army. Why? Because they knew those would be the guys who weren't going to be standing around idly when the Soviet Union tried to take over Poland a little bit later. So they went after them. So the first thing that the Castroites did, because of their Soviet tutelage, when they got into Havana, January of 1959, they put Che Guevara in charge of La Cabaña prison, and the people that they first went after, they called them Batista war criminals. Folks, again, documented in my books, the entire so-called guerrilla war, civil war in Cuba, as it was called in the New York Times and the media, and it's still played up in the History Channel and so forth, there were a grand total of 184 deaths. 184. In 2.5 years of civil war, folks, probably that many people have been shot in Chicago since we started the show. You know, that's 2 years of Rio's Carnival, 184. And yet, according to the Black Book of Communism, remember, folks, the Black Book of Communism is not published by crazy right-wing Cuban exiles like me. It was published by French scholars, and it was published into English by Harvard University Press. Not exactly a McCarthyite, right-wing Cuban crazy thing. 16,000 Cubans were murdered by firing squad in Cuba, mostly in the 60s. Now, how can you have 16,000 war criminals in a war that had 184 deaths on both sides. But it doesn't occur to anyone to bring this up because of the halo that surrounds this whole revolution. So 16,000 were massacred. So they went after the officer corps of Batista's army, calling them war criminals. And then, like all revolutions, they started devouring their own children. Probably 3/4 of the men who helped put Castro in power either wound up in front of the firing squad, in exile, or in prison in Cuba. This happens in all communist revolutions. They devour their own. It happened in the French Revolution too. Robespierre, remember that. So that's how they started going, just liquidating the enemies. Is basically, if you're not with us, you're against us. It was Castro stole a line from Mussolini. Everything within the revolution, nothing outside the revolution. Mussolini's was everything within the state, nothing outside the state, 1932. But Castro was a big fan of both Hitler and Mussolini in his youth. My dad was a University of Havana contemporary, classmate of Fidel Castro, and he was known to walk around campus with a copy of Mein Kampf, and he murdered personally 2, perhaps 3 of his college colleagues while in the late 40s when he was a college student.
Wow. So let's talk about your story now. I feel like this is an appropriate time to bring in your story, especially since you just mentioned your dad. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that prior to Castro coming to power, your parents would go on vacation in the U.S., but then they would return to Cuba. So obviously something changed because your family fled to the United States. So what was the breaking point for your family, and then what was that process of fleeing like? How did that story play out for you and your family?
Well, also, it wasn't just my parents. How many of our listeners realize that during the 1950s, up until 1954, more Cubans had vacationed in the U.S. than Americans had vacationed in Cuba? Because, hey, what we all hear from the media, what we saw in The Godfather 2, everything is that Cuba was a tourist playground for Americans. Well, guess what, folks? Actually, the U.S. was a tourist playground for Cubans, too. But the point is, obviously, by 1960, it was obvious. Well, my dad had his number, Castro's number, from day one because of the university. He said, my God, this country's going insane. What's going on? We're going to this. But most Cubans were going, well, the U.S. backed Castro. They must know what they're doing. But then after the Bay of Pigs, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, a lot of Cubans said, well, it's over. Because if the U.S. isn't going to help us out of this mess, then we're sunk. They came to their senses a little too late in the game, and there seems to be no way around this. And this is typical of communist countries. You say, well, why can't you just, start a revolution? There was a rip-roaring guerrilla war in Cuba. Started in 1960, and it finally petered out at around 1966 against the Castro regime, folks. Just remember, the only genuine guerrilla war in Cuba in the 20th century was fought against Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, not by Fidel Castro. But when we finally left, we went to my mom somehow put together all the paperwork, and it was me, my brother, who was 5, my sister, who was 8, now 7. We get to the airport, and we're loading the plane. We're getting ready to leave, and the soldiers came out. And just when we finally thought we were going to get ready to escape, they came and grabbed my father, and they dragged him off. You're not going anywhere. You're going with us. And at that time, that was October of 1961, hundreds of Cuban men and boys were being murdered by firing squad weekly. So we saw my dad being dragged off by the security forces, and so my mom just screams out, well, if you're not coming with us to the U.S., then we're not leaving either. We're staying here because my mom figured that he was going to the firing squad. And then he turned around just as he got to the door, and he said, "No, you are leaving, because whatever happens to me," we figured he was going to his death, "I don't want my children growing up in a communist country." So my mom somehow sucked it up, and we got to the U.S., and we got to Miami, where we already had relatives, and my mom called. I just remember we went to my aunt's house in Miami. She called Cuba. "Oh, what happened to Humberto? What happened?" And I remember sitting there, and she screamed, "I know!" And she fainted, dropped the phone. So my aunt came running up, picked up the phone. "What happened?" "I know!" But she didn't faint. What my mom had heard and what my aunt heard was that my father was in the G2 military police headquarters, which is where people went for torture prior to going to the firing squad. So I guess my mom figured, well, I'm in a country without a penny to my name, because the Castroites stole every penny from every Cuban. Cubans left Cuba with the clothes on their back, folks. Not just us, everybody did. So my mom's saying, well, I've got not a cent to my name, 3 children somehow raised, and apparently on top of all this, it appears that I am now a widow. So somehow she sucked it up, and we came to New Orleans, where we had closer relatives. And folks, when you leave a country with the clothes on your back, you want to go someplace where you have really close friends and relatives. And we was living here for a few months, and my mom picked up the phone again. I remember that. And she screamed again. Oh, I know, but this is a scream of joy, because it was my father calling from New Orleans International Airport saying, "Can somebody come pick me up?" He had been released. And what happened is that one of our maids, our maid in the 50s, had been an underground Castro movement operative while she was our maid. And she was a black lady. She was my nanny. And when she heard that my father was in jail, she was now with the government, with the communist government. And she heard my father been in jail and he was, under threat of being murdered. She went down to herself and she said, "You release Humberto. He just wants to get his family out of the country. Let him go. Get him out of the country. This man never, he was being played up, the capitalist exploiter." He says, "This man never mistreated me. They treated me as part of the family. I was part of the family. I have nothing against these people. You release this man right away." And boom, he came to the U.S. To make a long story short, me and my dad went deer hunting this morning. Okay? He's 90 years old. All right? And we're going deer hunting again Saturday with me, my sons, and him. 3 generations hunting. Now, tens of thousands of Cuban American families did not have that happy ending because of the figures that I mentioned earlier. At one point in time, 350,000 Cubans were jailed and tortured for political crimes out of a population of 6.6 million. So if you run those numbers against what Stalin was doing out of a population of 210 million, you see why I use that the rate of political torture and incarceration by Castro's regime was higher, slightly higher than it was under Stalin.
Friends, I'm sure you're very busy, and you're going to make certain purchases no matter what. So when you need to buy clothes, toys, electronics, books, movies, or any number of other products, buy them through our special Amazon link at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. And particularly relevant for today's episode, you can purchase books by today's guest Humberto Fontova, including Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant, and The Longest Romance to Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro, when you go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Make your shopping experience easier and faster and help support the Wake Up Call podcast by buying the stuff you're going to buy anyways through our link via wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your regular purchases and, at no extra cost to you, help support the show and keep the Wake Up Call podcast going. All right, so yeah, I want to continue on that subject. The brutality and just how horrible the Castro regime was. And we've talked about the murders and the firing squad executions that were committed by his regime, but it went beyond that, didn't it? Not only were they committing these murders, but they were televising them, and they were striking fear into people through that mechanism as well.
Oh, exactly. They were televising. They were veering, as I mentioned on some Facebook posts and on many articles. People are all horrified about the ISIS videos and so forth. Castro and Che were televising their murders, 60 years before ISIS was, and for the same reason, to terrorize the population. They wanted everyone to know this is what's going to happen to you if you don't get on board with the revolution. Remember, everything within the revolution, nothing outside of the revolution. They were televising these things, nationwide and so forth. But again, this type of information is not made available to most of our listeners by the mainstream media. It's, hey, they have great health care in Cuba, and they had a corrupt dictatorship before. Folks, here's what happens with these so-called right-wing dictators like Batista, who was black, by the way. How many of our listeners realize that Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew a black regime, overthrew a regime where the president, Batista, was a mulatto, technically, by Cuban standards, but in the U.S., he would be considered black. He was every bit as black as Jesse Jackson, as Soledad O'Brien, who I was recently on MSNBC with, and so forth. And he had many more blacks. There were many more blacks serving in the Cuban government under Batista than served under Fidel Castro's movement. And then you've got the Congressional Black Caucus and all these people constantly singing the praises of Fidel Castro. You've got Danny Glover just this week, by the way, who visited the grave of Che Guevara and sang his praises and considered it a great honor. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, just incredible. And I want to return to that subject in a moment. But let's look at a couple of issues between the U.S. and Cuba. So obviously the embargo is something that would come to mind right away when you bring up that subject, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So how did the embargo come about, seeing as you mentioned earlier that the CIA and the U.S. government was pro-Castro? So what brought about the embargo, and then how would you evaluate Castro's legacy from the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962?
Right. Well, yeah. People think, well, gosh, Ike and JFK woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Yeah, we're gonna punish those guys down in Cuba. No, folks. What happened is that Castro stole at Soviet gunpoint. Remember, the U.S. was being super, super, super good to Castro, not only when he was a rebel, but also his first year in power. The U.S. made 16 different back-channel attempts using the president of Argentina, Arturo Frondizi, as the conduit to try to figure out why Castro was so mad and to try to placate him. None of it worked. Castro stole at Soviet gunpoint $8 billion in today's dollars in U.S. property in Cuba. In other words, he stole every cent of U.S. property in Cuba, and he murdered and tortured a few of the American citizens who resisted the theft of their legal property in Cuba. So they stole all all U.S. property in Cuba. What are you supposed to do, folks? That's what brought about the embargo, and that is still on the books. Castro has not repaid a penny. According to the U.S. law, codified into U.S. law, we cannot open relations with Cuba. We cannot start normalizing with Cuba until this issue is addressed. Castro has laughed in the face of Obama. And as a matter of fact, his exact words were off the table every time Obama's so-called negotiators mentioned compensation for property that was stolen at gunpoint from U.S. citizens. That's changing right now under Trump, by the way. But that's what brought on the embargo. And by the way, folks, there really is nothing remotely remotely definable as an embargo for the last 15 years or so. For the last 15 years or so, the U.S. has actually been one of Cuba's top food suppliers because through executive orders, the so-called embargo has been loopholed half to death to where Castro can buy all the agricultural and medical products from the U.S. his little heart desires. The only thing the so-called embargo stipulates nowadays is that he has to pay cash up front. Cuba is the world's biggest deadbeat nation, the world's biggest creditor. They have stuck it to everyone who has extended them credit. Thanks to the so-called U.S. embargo, the U.S. taxpayer is among the very, very few on earth who have not been stiffed by Castro. Now, all these anti-embargo propagandists, what they really want is they want the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which is me and you listeners, that's our tax money, to finance the agricultural sales to Cuba, so that when Castro stiffs the vendors, like he has stiffed every vendor, every place on earth, everyone has cut off his credit, me and you, the taxpayer, take up that slack. And that's what I was trying desperately to explain to so-called libertarian John Stossel when he invited me on his show last year. It was John Stossel and Tom Palmer from the Cato Institute. And I said, well, wait a minute. You guys claim to be libertarians. What are you guys doing getting in bed with the farm lobby against the U.S. taxpayer? And this is something that's not very well understood. I call, in several chapters of my books, the so-called Cuban embargo the crown jewel of U.S. foreign policy. Because, first of all, people say, well, Humberto, it hasn't worked, Castro's still there. Folks, we're starting from a false premise. The embargo was never meant as regime change. It was meant as punishment for their theft of our property and as containment to contain the terrorism that we're spreading throughout South America. And I quote that in my book. There's a speech by Secretary of State of the time, Dean Rusk, where he made it a point that regime change in 1962 was not the embargo's goal. And by the way, that embargo helped bankrupt the Soviet Union. Thanks to the so-called embargo, thanks to the fact that we were not subsidizing Cuba, the Soviet Union was forced to pump $50 billion into Cuba. That's the equivalent, 7 or 8 Marshall Plans. And that was a big factor in the final bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, thanks to the so-called Cuban embargo.
Okay, and then what was Castro's legacy in regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis?
He wanted to launch the missiles. He sent a letter to Khrushchev at the time. It was on October 28th of 1962. He sent Khrushchev, and this is fully documented in my books, and it's by his son Sergei. They get a telegram in Cuba, in the Kremlin, where Castro is saying, Nikita, go ahead and press the button. Let's launch a preemptive nuclear strike. Well, they didn't say preemptive. They said, let's launch the missiles against the U.S. And Khrushchev freaked. He said, well, wait a minute. Hold on. He said, triple check this telegram. I want to make sure I'm reading this. Sure, this guy really wants me to launch the missiles against the U.S. And it came back, yes, he does. Yes, he does. And Khrushchev said, ooh, okay. I said, tell him what? To placate him, tell him that we'll launch them if the Yankees invade Cuba. He didn't mean to do that. He wasn't going to do it. He was just doing that to placate Castro. So here comes another telegram from Khrushchev. Hey, my spies in the U.S. tell me the Yankees are already loading the landing craft. They're going to be hitting us anytime now. Launch the missiles. Let's not let the Yankees get the first shot. And that's when Khrushchev freaked. because he had spies here too, and he knew nothing like that was taking place. And so that's when he said, in his exact words, "Get the missiles out of Cuba before something terrible happens." This is according to Nikita Khrushchev's own son, Sergei. That's what got the missiles out of Cuba. But the media and the History Channel, Kennedy stood up to the Russians. Kennedy did not stand up to the Russians. Khrushchev was horrified that Fidel and Che and Raul would get their fingers too close to the buttons. And Che Guevara himself affirmed that. A couple of weeks later, he did an interview with the Daily Worker in London in November of '62, and he said, "If the missiles had remained in Cuba, we would have fired them against the heart of the United States, including New York City. The victory of socialism is well worth millions of atomic victims." That's the champion. That is the idol of the peace freaks right there.
Yep. And one reason why they claim to idolize and love these people is because of the free health care and the wonderful literacy rate in Cuba. So what's the truth about Cuban health care and the literacy rate in Cuba?
In 1958, Cuba had the 13th lowest infant mortality rate on Earth. On Earth. It was lower than that in France, in Belgium, and many European countries. Cuban doctors would get immediate certification in the U.S. because of their competence. Now, Cuba is ravaged by tropical diseases, dengue fever among others, that were completely eradicated in Cuba at the turn of the last century. It is utterly bogus. What best dramatizes this is when the movie Sicko came out by Michael Moore. Sicko came out, and it was shown in Cuba, obviously. It was, the Castro regime's favorite movie. It was shown island-wide. And Cuban dissidents and Cubans were watching it and just fuming, burning up inside. They said, "My God, more BS that the world is believing about Castro." He says, "We have this wonderful health care." So some Cuban dissidents snuck little cameras into actual Cuban hospitals. The ones that Joe Sixpack Cubans go to, not the ones that the party officials go to and the tourists go to, but the ones that the average Cuban goes to. And they took pictures of horrible conditions inside Cuban hospitals, and they were going to show them. ABC was going to show them. It was going to do a special show, what Michael Moore didn't show you. Well, guess what? The regime got word of this show. And by the way, the show was going to be by John Stossel back when he was back with ABC. The regime got word of it, and they called in the ABC people and said, "You know something, if y'all show this," and this explains why so much BS about Cuba is believed by many Americans, because of the media. This is how they manipulate the media. If you show these videos, we will have to reevaluate your press credentials. Well, in other words, you play our propaganda game or we boot you out of here. Basically, that's how all the mainstream media gets their Havana press bureaus. You play their game. You essentially issue the propaganda sheet from the Castro's propaganda ministry, or you're out of there. And so ABC caved. They caved because they wanted to keep their Havana bureau. And they didn't. They showed a very diluted version of it. They did a show, I think, still titled about Sicko, but they didn't show it. And the Cuban dissidents were horrified. They said, "Man, this is terrible. Here we literally risked our lives to take these videos, to sneak these cameras, and now ABC caved." And I got word from my friends who are friends with some of the Cuban dissidents in Miami about it. And they said, "Well, what's going to happen now? We've got these videos. What are you going to do?" I said, "Hold on a second." And I made some calls to Hannity's producers and to Bill O'Reilly's producers. Because remember, Fox doesn't have a Havana bureau, so they cannot be blackmailed about it. Both of them called back within minutes, and Hannity actually showed them. In fact, it's on YouTube, what Sicko didn't show you, and you see the conditions inside actual Cuban hospitals with patients laying on beds without sheets or anything, covered in flies. You see the horrible conditions that Joe Sixpack Cuban actually has to endure in hospitals. Every doctor that emigrates from Cuba, the doctors who had the misfortune of being born in Cuba and being trained by Cubans, when they come to the U.S., they do not even, most of them do not even pass the exam to be doctors' assistants. In other words, the Castro regime calls them doctors, the media naturally calls them doctors, and yet in the U.S. they would barely qualify as nurses. All of this documented in my books, by the way.
Sure. And then what about the literacy rate? What's the truth about that? And what are people actually allowed to read in Cuba, even if they can read?
Well, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was outlawed. Animal Farm was outlawed. Needless to say, my books are all outlawed. In fact, the Communist Party newspaper in Cuba denounces me by name as a scoundrel and a criminal. It says, any mention of Humberto Fontova should be preceded by the terms scoundrel and traitor. In 1958, Cuba had 86% literacy rate. And then we've got to remember, is in 1958, Cuba only received its independence from Spain at the turn of the last century, 1900. And it had been utterly devastated in a revolutionary war of liberation. You know, Americans know it as the Spanish-American War, but it had been going on in Cuba for many years before that. So in a short 58 years, which is to say about the same amount of time that Castro's been in power, Cuba rose to the levels where I was telling you about, where they had a higher standard of living than much of Europe and an 87% bona fide literacy rate. Now, probably everyone in Cuba probably now can read, but they're not being educated. They are being indoctrinated. None other than Ray Bradbury, the author of Fahrenheit, what is it, 470, the Fahrenheit, the book with the burning books? 451. A few years ago, before his death, he mentioned that Cuba was still burning books. Probably 6 or 7 years ago, Cuba was still burning books, the regime. Part of the books that they were burning were his Animal Farm and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. People in Cuba, if you have the misfortune of meeting some of the more recent exiles or immigrants from Cuba, you'll notice right off the bat, sure, they can read. You know, you give them a newspaper and they can read, but it's horrible. They're robots. They have been robotized by the regime.
All right, so then why is Castro so beloved in Hollywood and by the mainstream media and among progressives? Given all that we've discussed, and granted they probably don't know a lot of this information, but you'd think they would have some idea about some of this, so why is he so beloved in those circles?
Because the regime did it from day one. From the day one, Castro came out with a quote in 1955. He said, "Propaganda is the heart of our struggle." Che Guevara's own diaries include the following quote. He says, "Much more important than guerrilla recruits for our guerrilla army were American media recruits to spread our propaganda." In other words, they made that a regime priority. Even before it was a regime, when there were still guerrillas, to manipulate, to entrance, to bribe, to enchant the worldwide media, in particular the U.S. media, to spread their propaganda. And in this aura of, he stood up to the vicious Yankee. You got to remember, they were the first hippies. You got to remember what they were like in 1958. What happened in the late 50s? You had the U.S. was the biggest fuddy-duddy in the world. You had a bald golfer as president. You had Ozzie and Harriet on TV. Leave It to Beaver a few years later. Oh, my goodness. And then all of a sudden, these cool, bearded, long-haired guys, man, take over in Cuba. Dig it, Daddy-O. They were the first beatniks. And this idea, this fable that they stood up to the Yankees, because not only, as I mentioned, did the Yankees actually put them in power, the CIA in particular, but after the missile crisis, what sealed the missile crisis was the deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev, where the missiles were going to come out anyway because Khrushchev was terrified, but Kennedy said, if you take the missiles out of Cuba, we will promise not only not to invade Cuba, not only not to molest the Castro regime, but to prevent any other Western power from molesting the Castro regime. You know, so when people say, gosh, that's amazing how Castro poked the eye and stood up to 11 U.S. presidents, complete and utter poppycock. Since October of 1962, the U.S. was Castro's protector. So let's call him a brilliant diplomat, because he hid behind the skirts of not only the United States, thanks to Kennedy's deal, but behind the skirts of the Soviet Union. And then when some Cuban freedom fighters who were launching raids from South Florida, they were all being arrested after JFK signed his deal with Khrushchev. They're all being arrested because we can't molest Castro, so they moved their operations to the Bahamas. Well, Kennedy got on the phone with his friend, the British Prime Minister, and it started arresting. So here's this guy that's worldwide known as the plucky underdog, David, who stood up to the... No, folks, he hid behind the skirts of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. Again, call him a brilliant diplomat, but can we please dispense with the plucky, brave underdog? Nothing of the sort.
All right, so one final question for you, and it's a two-parter. Obviously, Raul Castro became the president in Cuba even prior to Fidel's passing. Has Raul Castro been any different in power than his brother was? And what are the chances that we see communism end in the near future in Cuba?
Raul is slightly different from his brother only in that he is worse. Repression in Cuba right now is at a 15-year high. Political arrests. And what little free enterprise was being allowed in Cuba when they were desperate about 10 years ago has been curtailed right now. Why is that? It is precisely because of the libertarian prescription for Cuba. Tourists. Cuba had record tourism last year. Almost 4 million tourists have visited Cuba. Oh, gosh, Humberto, you know, if we just let people travel to Cuba and bring back, gosh, wouldn't that open it up? I mean, that wouldn't be great. Wouldn't that kind of blindside the commies? Complete poppycock for people who actually follow the issue. Every dollar, loonie, peso spent by tourists in Cuba lands in the pocket of the regime who owns the tourist industry, lock, stock, and barrel. So because of this tourism windfall to Cuba, they are now fat and happy, and they are cracking down on the Cuban people like they haven't done it in 15 years, thanks to Obama.
All right, well, we'll leave it there, and thank you so much for joining me and being so generous with your time. If someone wants to learn more about what we've been discussing today, and if someone wants to follow your work, then where should they go?
Yeah, hfontova.com. The beauty of it is if you put either Humberto with the H in front or Fontova in Google, the first thing that pops up is my website. And I write weekly columns for Daily Caller, for Town Hall, for Front Page, and a few others. And they're all listed on my website along with all of my books. So thank you very much for the opportunity to spread the truth.
Well, definitely, and I want to remind everybody to go take a look at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Castro. And, of course, there will be links to the 3 books I mentioned in the introduction and hfontova.com and all of the resources that we've mentioned over the course of this discussion. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Castro is the show notes page for this episode. And And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher so you can get all the episodes and not miss any. And Humberto, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss Fidel Castro and to smash some myths about the Castro regime and about Cuba that amazingly are still floating around out there. So thank you so much.
And that's another thing. Yeah, you asked me, I don't think anything's going to change in Cuba because Alejandro, Raul's son, is already been pegged, and Alejandro is a fanatical KGB-trained Stalinist. So, no, I don't think it's sad. I'd love to end on an optimistic note, but I really don't think anything changing in Cuba. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's unfortunate to hear, but at least we can hope for better times in Cuba at least. So thank you so much for joining me.
All right, amigo. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.